Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives. Tonight we're heading to Mozambique, and if you've never heard of this place, buckle up, because it's got everything. A coastline longer than the entire US West Coast, a river system so massive it's basically the country's central nervous system, mountains hiding virgin rainforests that scientists only discovered by browsing Google Earth, and a climate that produces approximately 5 catastrophic cyclones per year. So just your average relaxing beach destination. Before we dive in, quick housekeeping. If you're enjoying these deep dives, hit subscribe, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from, and maybe dim the lights because we're settling in for the long haul tonight. Mozambique's got a lot of ground to cover. Literally. We're talking 800,000 square kilometers of it. Chapter 1. A country built by rivers and battered by storms. Right, let's start with the basics, because Mozambique's geography is one of those situations where the landscape basically determines everything that happens to the people living on it. And the first thing you need to understand is that this country is essentially a giant drainage basin with a coastline attached. If you look at a map, Mozambique is shaped like the letter Y that got stretched vertically and then had its right arm shoved against the Indian Ocean. That fork in the middle? That's where Malawi juts into Mozambican territory like an uninvited guest at a party. The whole thing is roughly 3 times the size of Great Britain, which sounds massive until you realise that 44% of it is lowland sitting below 200 metres elevation. Translation: when the rains come, a lot of this country becomes a very large, very angry lake. The coastline runs for about 2,500 kilometres from the Rovuma River in the north, which forms the border with Tanzania, all the way down to Ponta de Ouro in the south, where South Africa takes over. That's roughly the distance from San Diego to Seattle, except instead of Highway 1 you've got mangrove swamps, coral reefs, sandy beaches, and a collection of offshore islands that look like someone scattered them carelessly across the Mozambique Channel. The northern coast is all rocky headlands and rugged cliffs, with islands hugging the shore like a necklace. The central section, from Bazaruto Island up to Angoche Island, is known as the Bight of Sofala, though it's got a much less flattering nickname, the Swamp Coast. Guess why? If you guessed extensive mangrove swamps and coastal wetlands, congratulations, you win absolutely nothing except the knowledge that you're geographically literate. Now here's the thing about Mozambique's coast. For all that beachfront real estate, the country has shockingly few good natural harbours. The coast is generally low-lying, which is great if you're a mangrove, but terrible if you're trying to build a functioning seaport. There are 3 exceptions: Maputo in the south, Beira in the centre, and Nacala in the north. These became the country's lifelines to the outside world, which meant that when various empires showed up looking to extract resources, they already knew exactly where to park their ships. We'll get to that mess later. For now, just know that geography had already decided where Mozambique's economic centres would be centuries before anyone drew a border. Let's talk about the Zambezi, because you can't understand Mozambique without understanding this river. It's the 4th longest river in Africa, and it cuts the country almost perfectly in half, like someone drew a line with a ruler and said, everything north of this is one vibe. Everything south is another vibe. The Zambezi starts its journey way up in Zambia, meanders through Angola, dips back into Zambia, then crashes into Mozambique and decides to create an 8,000 square kilometre delta of mangrove swamps before finally dumping into the Indian Ocean. The delta alone is larger than the entire state of Delaware. It's not even the only massive river in the country. You've got the Limpopo in the south, the Save, the Rovuma, the Pungwe, and about 20 others, all of them originating in the highlands to the west. and flowing downhill toward the coast like water has this annoying habit of doing. The thing about having 25 major rivers is that when it rains, all of that water has to go somewhere. And Mozambique sits downstream of 9 major river basins, which means it's not just dealing with its own rainfall, it's dealing with everyone else's rainfall too. Zimbabwe gets a storm, Mozambique gets a flood, Zambia has a wet season, Mozambique's rivers swell. It's like living at the bottom of a very large, very poorly designed gutter system. The Zambezi Valley, which runs through the centre of the country, is part of the Great Rift Valley, that massive geological scar that's slowly tearing East Africa apart. This makes it Mozambique's most dramatic geographic feature, and also one of its driest areas, which is genuinely ironic given that it's a river valley. But the land here rises gently on either side, creating a rain shadow effect, so parts of the Zambezi Valley get as little as 375 millimeters of rain per year. Meanwhile, the highlands along the borders with Malawi and Zimbabwe are getting drenched with 1,500 millimeters annually. Geography is nothing if not unfair. Speaking of highlands, let's head west, because while 44% of Mozambique is coastal lowland, the rest of it is decidedly not flat. As you move inland from the coast, the land starts climbing. First you hit the uplands in the centre, sitting at a modest 600 to 750 metres. Keep going west and you reach the high plateaus in the northwest, and finally, along the borders with Zimbabwe, Malawi and Zambia, you get actual mountains. The highest peak in the country is Monte Binga, sitting at 2,440 metres on the border with Zimbabwe. From the summit, on a hypothetically clear day with a telescope, you could just barely see the Indian Ocean 190 kilometres away, which is a genuinely absurd thought. The mountain sits in the Chimanimani range, an area so thick with pine and mahogany trees that it looks like someone airlifted a chunk of temperate forest and dropped it into southern Africa. Then there's Mount Gorongosa, which sits northeast of the Manica Plateau at around 2,000 metres. This mountain is important, and we'll come back to it when we talk about wildlife. But for now, just know that it's made of granite. It's got rainforest at the base of a series of limestone gorges, and rivers flowing off its slopes water the entire Gorongosa Valley below. It's essentially the reason one of Africa's greatest national parks exists. The second highest peak is Mount Namuli at 2,419 metres, and then there's Mount Mabu, which sits at 1,700 metres and has a virgin rainforest covering about 7,000 hectares. Here's the wild part. Scientists didn't know this forest existed until 2005, when researchers from Kew Royal Botanic Gardens were browsing Google Earth looking for potential biodiversity hotspots and went, "Wait, what's that massive green blob in northern Mozambique?" Turns out it was a completely unexplored rainforest full of species new to science, which really makes you wonder what else is hiding in plain sight on satellite imagery. The mountains in the west aren't a continuous range. They're more like a series of highlands and plateaus with names that sound like they came from a fantasy novel. The Angonia Highlands, the Lichinga Plateau, the Manica Plateau. In between them you've got valleys and depressions and the occasional Inselberg, which is a fancy geological term for isolated mountain that rises abruptly from flat terrain like someone forgot to smooth it out. These features mark the transition zones between medium and high plateau regions, and they give the landscape this dramatic, almost theatrical quality. One minute you're driving through flat grassland, the next minute there's a mountain in your face, keeps you awake. Down in the south, running parallel to the coast behind Maputo, you've got the Lebombo Mountains, which top out at a thoroughly unimpressive 630 metres. They're technically a continuation of South Africa's Drakensberg range, but they're more like very enthusiastic hills than actual mountains. Still, they're enough to create some geographic variation in an otherwise extremely flat southern region. The Great Mozambican Plain dominates everything south of the Save River, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Vast, low-lying, and prone to flooding. If you're standing on this plain during the rainy season and you see storm clouds on the horizon, you should probably start thinking about higher ground. Now let's talk climate, because Mozambique's weather is the kind of thing that shapes history whether you like it or not. The country technically spans from tropical in the north to subtropical in the extreme south, but honestly the whole place behaves like it's tropical. You've got two main seasons, wet and dry. The wet season runs from November to March, and this is when Mozambique gets about 80% of its total annual rainfall. The dry season is April to October, and it's cooler and more pleasant, assuming you enjoy temperatures in the low 20s Celsius instead of the high 20s. The coastal areas are warm to hot year-round thanks to the Mozambique Current, which flows south along the coast and raises both temperatures and humidity to levels that make you immediately regret wearing anything with sleeves. Rainfall varies wildly depending on where you are. The wettest regions are the highlands along the Malawi and Zimbabwe borders and the southeast coast between Beira and Maputo. These areas get between 1,000 and 1,500 millimeters per year. Beira, sitting right on the central coast, gets absolutely hammered with 1,600 millimeters annually, which is more than London gets by a factor of 2. Meanwhile, the inland lowlands, particularly the Zambezi Valley, are comparative deserts. Some spots get as little as 300 millimeters per year. It's the same country, but the climate treats different regions like they're on different planets. And then there are the cyclones. Oh, the cyclones. Mozambique gets hit by approximately 5 tropical cyclones per year on average, mostly during the wet season between November and April when ocean temperatures are at their warmest. Over the past 70 years, the frequency of these storms has been increasing, which is exactly the trend you want to see when you're a low-lying coastal nation with inadequate infrastructure and millions of people living in flood-prone areas. Recent cyclones have been genuinely catastrophic. In 2019, Cyclone Idai slammed into the central coast near Beira, and then Cyclone Kenneth hit the north a few weeks later, which was the first time in recorded history that 2 intense cyclones struck Mozambique in the same season. Between them, they killed more than 1,000 people and displaced hundreds of thousands more. In late 2024 and early 2025, Mozambique was hit by cyclones Chido, Dikeledi, and Jude in rapid succession, each one bringing winds over 120 kilometers per hour and rainfall totals that would make a meteorologist weep. The problem with cyclones in Mozambique isn't just the wind, it's the rainfall. These storms can dump 200 to 300 millimeters of rain in a 24-hour period. And remember, Mozambique is downstream of 9 major river basins. So you get the cyclone rainfall, plus all the runoff from upstream countries, plus inadequate drainage infrastructure, plus low-lying coastal plains, and you end up with flooding that can cover entire districts. The northern provinces, particularly Cabo Delgado and Nampula, are especially vulnerable. During Cyclone Dikeledi in January 2025, some areas recorded 247 millimeters in a single day, and winds hit 180 kilometers per hour. Nearly 300,000 people were affected. Tens of thousands of houses were destroyed. And this is just normal now. Climate projections suggest Mozambique will experience more Category 4 and 5 cyclones in the future, with more intense rainfall. So that's going well. But here's the thing about Mozambique's geography. For all the floods and cyclones and drainage disasters, the land itself is staggeringly beautiful and ecologically rich. The coastal plains are home to some of the most extensive mangrove systems in the world, The Zambezi Delta alone supports critical fisheries that feed hundreds of thousands of people. Offshore, you've got the Bazaruto Archipelago in the south, which is basically a collection of pristine coral-fringed islands with crystal-clear water and marine biodiversity that includes dolphins, humpback whales, manta rays, sea turtles, and the extremely rare dugong. Further north, the Quirimbas Islands and the Primeras and Segundas Archipelago provide nesting sites for seabirds and breeding grounds for marine species. The continental shelf off Beira extends 140 kilometers out to sea, making it one of the country's most important marine fisheries. Inland, the Miombo woodlands dominate the plateaus, filled with acacia, mahogany, baobabs, and a dozen other species that have adapted to the seasonal rainfall patterns. The river valleys support fever tree forests and floodplain ecosystems that explode with life during the wet season. And then there's Gorongosa National Park, which deserves its own paragraph because it's genuinely one of the most remarkable conservation stories in Africa. Gorongosa sits at the southern end of the Great Rift Valley in central Mozambique, covering more than 4,000 square kilometers of valley floor and surrounding plateaus. Rivers flowing off Mount Gorongosa water the plain below, creating a mosaic of grasslands, acacia savannas, termite mounds, seasonally flooded pans, and patches of dry forest. The plateaus above hold miombo and montane forests, and at the base of Mount Gorongosa there's a spectacular rainforest nestled in limestone gorges. In the 1970s, before Mozambique's civil war, Gorongosa was home to some of the densest wildlife populations in Africa. Then the war happened, and by 1994 the park had been reduced to about 7,000 animals total. Elephants, which once numbered in the thousands, were down to 100. Most species had declined by 99%. It was an ecological catastrophe. But in 2008, the Mozambican government partnered with the US-based Carr Foundation to launch a restoration project, and the results have been extraordinary. By 2022, aerial surveys counted over 100,000 large animals in the park, not estimates. Actual counts: elephants, waterbuck, impala, sable antelope, warthogs, hippos, crocodiles, lions, leopards, and African wild dogs have all rebounded. The park now employs over 1,600 people, supports scientific research through the EO, Wilson Biodiversity Laboratory, and has documented nearly 8,000 species, including 200 that were previously unknown to science, and 25 that are endemic to Gorongosa. It's been called Africa's greatest wildlife restoration story, and honestly, that's not hyperbole. So that's Mozambique's Geographic Foundation, a country shaped like a Y, carved by rivers, battered by cyclones, rising gradually from coastal swamps to inland mountains, and somehow managing to be both ecologically magnificent and hydrologically cursed at the same time. The landscape determines where people live, where cities grow, how the economy functions, and which regions get flattened by storms every year. Geography, in other words, is not just background scenery here, it's the main character. And now that you know the stage, we can start talking about the people who've been living on it for the past 2,000 years. Which is where we're headed next. Chapter 2: Iron, Ivory, and the Birth of Kingdoms. So you've got the landscape. Now let's talk about the people who started showing up to actually live on it. If you could rewind about 2,000 years and stand on the Mozambican coast, you'd see something fascinating happening. Groups of Bantu-speaking farmers and iron workers were arriving from the interior, part of a massive migration that had been unfolding across Africa for centuries. These weren't invading armies. These were families, clans, extended kinship networks moving gradually southward and eastward, bringing with them technologies that would fundamentally reshape the region. Iron smelting, advanced agriculture, and pottery techniques that left behind distinctive ceramic styles archaeologists now use to track their movements. The pottery found along the Mozambican coast from this period, called kwaleware, dates to around 200 to 300 CE, and it shares characteristics with ceramics found all the way up in Kenya and Tanzania, which tells you these weren't isolated communities, they were part of something much larger. The Bantu migrants weren't arriving in empty wilderness. The coast and interior were already inhabited by Khoisan-speaking hunter-gatherers who'd been living here for millennia. What happened when these groups met is one of those historical questions where the evidence gets murky and scholars argue a lot, but the general consensus is it was complicated. Some communities absorbed each other through intermarriage, some displaced each other through conflict, some coexisted in parallel for generations. The Bantu had iron tools, which made clearing land and farming significantly easier, and they had agricultural knowledge that allowed them to establish permanent settlements near rivers and fertile valleys. That gave them an advantage, and over time, Bantu languages and cultures came to dominate most of the region. But genetic studies show that in Mozambique, unlike further south in South Africa, there was relatively little intermixing between Bantu and Khoisan populations, which suggests the dynamics here were different. Possibly more displacement, possibly just different settlement patterns. The archaeological record doesn't provide a neat narrative, which is frustrating but also honest. By around 500 CE, Bantu-speaking communities were well established throughout Mozambique. They grew sorghum and millet, kept cattle and goats, worked iron into tools and weapons, and lived in villages governed by clan structures that balanced kinship ties with practical leadership. And then something interesting started happening on the coast. Arab and Persian traders, who'd been sailing the Indian Ocean for centuries, began establishing more permanent trading posts along the East African shoreline. They were following the monsoon winds which blow predictably northeast from November to March and southwest from April to October, making round-trip voyages between the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, India, and the African coast, not just possible but relatively routine. These traders wanted ivory, gold, rhinoceros horn, tortoise shells, and eventually enslaved people. In return, they brought cotton cloth, ceramics, glass beads, iron tools, and spices. And out of these exchanges, something entirely new emerged: Swahili culture. The word Swahili comes from the Arabic Sawahil, meaning coasts, or people of the coast, and it's a perfect description. Swahili culture was fundamentally coastal, fundamentally hybrid, and fundamentally commercial. It was Bantu at its core, the language, the social structures, the agricultural base, but shaped by centuries of interaction with Arab and Persian merchants who settled, intermarried with local women, and brought Islam with them. By the 8th century, mosques were being built along the coast. By the 12th century, Swahili had evolved into a distinct language, Bantu grammar with heavy Arabic borrowing, especially in vocabulary related to trade, religion, law, and urban life. And by the 15th century, the Swahili coast was a network of prosperous city-states stretching from Mogadishu in modern Somalia all the way down to Sofala in southern Mozambique. Sofala is where Mozambique enters the big leagues of Indian Ocean trade. The town sits near the mouth of the Zambezi River, and it functioned as the primary export hub for gold coming from the interior, specifically from the Zimbabwe Plateau, where kingdoms like Great Zimbabwe were mining and smelting gold on a scale that made the whole region wealthy. By the 10th century, Arab geographers were writing about Sofala as a prosperous harbour, where merchants extracted gold dust through alliances with local African rulers. The town was controlled by Kilwa, the most powerful Swahili city-state further north in Tanzania, which gained dominance over Sofala in the 1180s and essentially monopolized the southern gold trade for the next 3 centuries. Gold, ivory, iron, copper, and enslaved people flowed out through Sofala. Chinese porcelain, Persian glazed pottery, Indian cotton, glass beads, and dates flowed in. The town became stupidly rich, and the people running the trade, Swahili merchants, Arab middlemen, local African chiefs, formed an elite class that built stone houses, commissioned elaborate mosques, and lived in a style that visiting Portuguese explorers would later describe with a mixture of admiration and envy. But here's the thing about Sofala and the other coastal trading cities. They were middlemen. The actual sources of wealth, the gold mines, the elephant hunting grounds, the productive agricultural regions were inland. And inland, away from the coast, other kingdoms were taking shape. Around the 13th century, groups of related clans began migrating into the region west and southwest of Lake Malawi, moving down from the Congo basin in what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo. These were the Moravi, and they had plans. By the 15th century, they'd established a confederacy that stretched across parts of modern Malawi, Zambia, and northern Mozambique, organized around a political system that was genuinely sophisticated. The paramount chief, called the Kalonga, ruled from the secular capital at Manthimba. Religious authority was handled separately by the Banda clan, who operated from the spiritual capital at Mankamba and were responsible for producing healers, sages, and metallurgists. It was a careful separation of powers. The Kalonga handled governance and military matters, the Banda handled the sacred. And it worked, for a while. The Moravi Confederacy wasn't a tightly centralized empire. It was more like a loose coalition of tributary kingdoms, Undi, Lundu, Mkanda, and others, each ruled by its own chief, but acknowledging the Kalonga's overall authority. The system held together through a combination of kinship ties, religious legitimacy, and economic interdependence. The Moravi controlled valuable ivory-producing regions and had access to iron deposits which they traded with Portuguese and Arab merchants on the Zambezi and at the coast. By the 1600s, when Portuguese traders like Gaspar Bacaro first wrote about them, the Moravi Confederacy was a major regional power. Father Manuel Barreto, a Jesuit priest writing in the 1660s, described it as covering an area from the Mozambique coast between the Zambezi River and Quelimane, all the way inland for several hundred miles. At its peak in the 17th century, the Confederacy extended from the Tonga and Tumbuka territories in the north down to the Lower Shire in the south, and west to the Luangwa and Zambezi River valleys. But confederacies are fragile things. The problem with a political system based on tributary relationships is that it only works as long as the paramount authority can deliver benefits that outweigh the costs of subordination. And when Portuguese, Arab, and Swahili traders started dealing directly with individual Moravi chiefs, bypassing the Kalonga entirely, the whole structure started cracking. Why send your ivory tribute up to Manthimba when you could trade it yourself and keep the profit? By the 1700s, the Confederacy had fragmented into autonomous factions. Succession disputes weakened the bonds between the Kalonga and the tributary kingdoms. The central authority's ability to control trade collapsed. And then, in the 1820s, a catastrophic famine hit, followed by the arrival of the Ngoni people fleeing the Mfecane, the great upheaval in southern Africa caused by the expansion of the Zulu kingdom under Shaka. The Ngoni were militarily organized, battle-hardened, and not interested in negotiating. They raided Moravi territories, recruited men into their armies, married Moravi women, and generally accelerated the Confederacy's disintegration. By the late 1800s, the Moravi as a unified political entity were gone. But back to the coast, because while the Moravi were building and then losing their confederacy inland, the Swahili city-states were having their own golden age and then spectacular collapse. For about 500 years, from roughly 1000 to 1500 CE, the Swahili coast was one of the most prosperous and cosmopolitan regions in the world. Cities like Kilwa, Mombasa, Zanzibar, and Sofala were genuinely international. You could walk through the markets and hear Arabic, Persian, Swahili, various Bantu languages, and probably some Indian dialects and Chinese as well. The architecture reflected this mix. Coral stone buildings with Arabic-style arched doorways, courtyards designed for the hot coastal climate, mosques with minarets visible from the harbour. The ruling class was overwhelmingly Muslim, often claiming Persian or Arab ancestry even when their actual heritage was heavily African. This wasn't dishonesty so much as strategic identity management. DPD, claiming Shirazi descent, that is, Persian lineage from the city of Shiraz, gave local elites legitimacy in the eyes of Arab traders and differentiated them from the non-Muslim populations inland. The wealth was staggering. Kilwa minted its own coins, copper, silver and gold, which is something you only do when your economy is sophisticated enough to need standardized currency. The city controlled not just Sofala but also other ports and island states including Mombasa, Pemba, Mafia, Mozambique Island, Malindi, Inhambane, Comoro and Zanzibar. The Sultan of Kilwa was essentially running a maritime commercial empire. And then, in 1498, Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and showed up on the Swahili coast looking for a route to India, which was, in hindsight, very bad news for everyone involved. The Portuguese didn't come to trade. They came to control trade. They wanted a monopoly on the Indian Ocean spice routes, and they were willing to use violence to get it. By 1505, they'd built a fortress at Sofala. By 1507, they'd fortified Mozambique Island. The Swahili city-states, which had never needed large armies because their wealth came from commerce rather than conquest, were completely unprepared. They had no unified political structure, no coordinated defence, and no weapons that could match Portuguese cannons and firearms. The Portuguese sacked cities, demanded tribute, disrupted trade networks that had functioned smoothly for centuries, and generally behaved like pirates with a flag. Kilwa, which had been the wealthiest city on the coast, was looted in 1505. Its decline was swift and brutal. But here's what's interesting. The Portuguese presence in Mozambique was always more ambitious than effective. They controlled the coast barely, but they never really penetrated the interior in any systematic way. They built forts, they demanded taxes, they tried to monopolize the ivory and gold trade. But they didn't establish administration, they didn't invest in infrastructure, and they didn't develop the kind of extractive colonial economy they'd create elsewhere. Mostly they just disrupted things, which meant that for the next few centuries, Mozambique existed in this weird liminal state where the coast was nominally under Portuguese control, but actual power was fragmented among local chiefs, Arab merchants who'd allied with Omani traders to push back against Portuguese dominance, and the remnants of inland kingdoms like the Moravi who were dealing with their own problems. So by the time we get to the late 1700s, Mozambique's political landscape looks like this. The coast is dotted with Portuguese forts and trading posts that function more like glorified tax collection points than actual colonies. The interior is divided among various African kingdoms and chiefdoms, some still powerful, others fragmenting under pressure from succession disputes, slave raids, and the arrival of new groups fleeing conflicts further south. The Swahili trading networks are a shadow of their former glory. The Maravi Confederacy is falling apart, and the Portuguese are clinging to the coast, extracting what they can, but not really governing anything. It's a mess, but it's a mess that's been shaped by centuries of migration, trade, cultural exchange, political experimentation, and the fundamental fact that Mozambique sits at the intersection of multiple worlds: the African interior, the Swahili coast, the Indian Ocean trade network, and increasingly European imperial ambitions, all of which is about to get significantly more complicated. But that's the next chapter. Chapter 3: Warlords, Slaves, and the Slow Collapse of Everything. Right, so we've established that by the late 1500s, the Portuguese had fortified the coast, disrupted the Swahili trading networks, and set up shop in the Zambezi Valley, hoping to get rich off gold and ivory. What they did next was invent one of the more creative systems of colonial mismanagement in African history: the prazo. The prazo system, which started in the early 1600s and limped along in various forms until the 1930s, was essentially the Portuguese crown's attempt to transplant feudalism to Africa. Here's how it worked. The crown issued land grants, prazos de coroa, to Portuguese settlers, traders, and aristocrats. These grants gave the prazo holder, or prazeiro, control over vast estates along the Zambezi Valley and in other parts of Mozambique. The prazeiro was supposed to pay an annual tribute to the crown, usually in gold. In exchange, they got near total authority over the land and the people living on it. They could collect taxes, control trade, and recruit labour. It was, on paper, a way to establish Portuguese control over the interior, without actually having to send administrators, soldiers, or any functional government infrastructure, which should tell you everything you need to know about how well this was going to work. Here's where it gets interesting. The prazos were originally supposed to be held by Portuguese families, but through intermarriage with local African and Indian women, they quickly became Afro-Portuguese or Indo-Portuguese centres of power. Many prazeiros were mixed race, culturally hybrid, and operating with a level of autonomy that made the Portuguese crown deeply uncomfortable. They raised their own private armies called chikunda, composed primarily of enslaved Africans, who were armed, trained, and used to defend the prazo, raid neighbouring territories for more slaves and ivory, and generally act as the prazeiro's personal military force. So you had these quasi-independent warlords scattered across the Zambezi Valley, nominally Portuguese but functionally doing whatever they wanted, defended by slave armies that were better organised than anything the actual Portuguese colonial administration could field. The most powerful of these warlords was Manuel Antonio de Souza, also known as Gouveia, a settler from Portuguese India who by the mid-1800s controlled most of the southern Zambezi Valley and a massive chunk of territory to the south. Gouveia operated like a feudal lord. He had fortified strongholds at the confluence of major rivers. He commanded thousands of Chikunda soldiers. He traded in gold, ivory, and slaves on a scale that made him richer than most Portuguese officials. And the Portuguese government, sitting on the coast in Mozambique Island or down in Maputo, could do absolutely nothing about it because they lacked the military capacity to challenge him, so they just let it happen, which is a recurring theme in Portuguese colonial history. Ambitious plans, minimal execution, a lot of shrugging. Meanwhile, the slave trade was escalating into something catastrophic. Slavery had existed in Mozambique before the Portuguese arrived. African chiefs traded captives. Arab merchants moved people across the Indian Ocean, but it was relatively small scale. That changed in the 1700s, and by the late 1700s it had become the single most profitable enterprise in the entire region. There were several factors driving this. First, drought. Starting in the 1760s and becoming chronic by the 1790s, Mozambique experienced prolonged droughts that caused crop failures, cattle deaths, and the collapse of traditional trade networks. Chiefs who couldn't feed their people turned to raiding, banditry increased, vulnerable communities were attacked, and their members sold to coastal traders. Second, demand from the Americas was skyrocketing. The transatlantic slave trade was in full swing, and Mozambique became a major supplier for Brazil and Cuba, especially after the British started restricting the West African trade in the early 1800s. Third, the prazo system itself was fueling the trade. Prazeros, whose estates were supposed to be productive agricultural operations, found it far more lucrative to just capture people and sell them. Between 1800 and 1880, hundreds of thousands of Mozambicans were enslaved and shipped out through ports like Quelimane, Mozambique Island, and Ibo. The scale is hard to comprehend. Entire villages were emptied, traditional social structures disintegrated. The Yao traders, operating out of the Lake Malawi region, developed extensive slave networks that fed captives to Kilwa and Mozambique Island. Tsonga ivory traders moved slaves from the Zimbabwe Plateau and the Transvaal region down to coastal ports at Inhambane and Maputo. The Portuguese, despite officially abolishing the slave trade in 1836 and 1842, continued to participate enthusiastically in what was now a black market operation. The legal abolitions meant nothing. An estimated 1.3 to 1.4 million people were transported from Mozambican ports to the Indian Ocean islands and the Americas even after the trade was supposedly banned. It was, by any measure, an atrocity. And then, just when you think the situation can't get more chaotic, the Mfecane arrived. The Mfecane, literally the crushing or the scattering, was a period of massive upheaval and violence in southern Africa triggered by the expansion of the Zulu kingdom under Shaka in the 1820s. Shaka's military innovations, regimented armies, new fighting tactics, brutal discipline allowed the Zulu to conquer neighbouring groups and send others fleeing in all directions. Some of these fleeing groups ended up in Mozambique, and they brought Zulu-style military organisation with them. The most significant arrival was Soshangane, a general from the Ndwandwe people who fled north after being defeated by Shaka. Around 1824, Soshangane crossed into Mozambique and started building his own empire. He called it Gaza, after his grandfather, and it became the most powerful African state in the region. Soshangane was methodical. He conquered the local Tsonga and Shona peoples, incorporated them into his kingdom, imposed Zulu military structures, and established a regimented system that separated different classes of people. Defeated groups were conscripted into his armies, specifically into a regiment called the Mavuland Lela, which literally means those who sweep the road clean, because they were sent ahead of the main army to clear obstacles. By the 1830s, Soshangane controlled territory stretching from the Limpopo River in the south to the Zambezi in the north, covering most of what's now southern and central Mozambique. He even forced the Portuguese coastal settlements to pay him tribute, which is genuinely impressive when you consider that the Portuguese had been in Mozambique for 300 years at this point. Soshangane ruled the Gaza kingdom for 37 years, until his death in 1858. His empire was based on military conquest, cattle raiding, and extracting tribute from subject peoples and Portuguese settlements alike. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't democratic, but it was effective, and it filled a power vacuum that the Portuguese were completely incapable of filling themselves. After Soshangane died, his sons fought over succession in a civil war that lasted years. Eventually, with Portuguese help, because the Portuguese were always willing to meddle if it served their interests, Mzila, one of Soshangane's sons, consolidated power in 1861 and ruled until 1884. His son, Gungunyana, took over after that and moved the capital south to Manjacaze, closer to the Portuguese. This turned out to be a tactical error because it made him easier to defeat when the Portuguese finally got their act together in the 1890s, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The rise of the Gaza Kingdom coincided with the final collapse of the old African chieftaincies in the Zambezi region. The prolonged droughts, the slave trade, the expansion of Portuguese control through the prazos, and the arrival of militarized Nguni groups all combined to shatter the political structures that had existed for centuries. The once mighty Maravi Confederacy was gone. Local chiefs who'd controlled trade networks and maintained regional stability were either dead, displaced, or reduced to tributary status under more powerful warlords. In their place you had fortified strongholds controlled by Prazeiros and their Chikunda armies, raiding the interior for slaves and ivory. You had the Gaza Kingdom dominating the south and centre. You had Portuguese officials on the coast pretending they were in charge while actually controlling very little beyond the walls of their forts. It was a fragmented, violent, unstable mess. And the ivory trade, which had been important for centuries, intensified during this period as well. Elephants were hunted relentlessly. Skilled hunters, often working for Prazeiros or African chiefs, tracked herds across the interior and brought tusks to coastal markets. The trade routes that had once moved gold now primarily moved ivory and slaves, with occasional shipments of copper, iron, and other goods. The economic centre of gravity had shifted. Gold mining, which had attracted the Portuguese in the first place, was in decline. The real money was in human beings and dead elephants. By the mid-1800s, Mozambique was a case study in how not to run a colony. The Portuguese had been there for over 300 years and had almost nothing to show for it. They controlled a few coastal towns, some isolated forts, and the island of Mozambique, which served as their administrative capital until the late 1800s. They'd ceded effective control of the interior to Prazeiros, who operated as independent warlords. They'd participated enthusiastically in the slave trade even after it was illegal. They'd failed to establish any meaningful infrastructure, no roads, no schools, no hospitals, no functioning legal system outside the major towns. Their administration was corrupt, understaffed, and largely absent, and they were being challenged militarily by African kingdoms like Gaza that had better organised armies and more effective governance structures. Part of the problem was that Portugal itself was in decline. The Portuguese Empire's golden age was long over. Brazil had become independent in 1822, taking with it Portugal's most valuable colony. The spice trade that had made Portugal wealthy in the 1600s was now dominated by the British and Dutch. Lisbon was focused on trying to maintain Angola, its colony on the west coast of Africa, and didn't have the resources or political will to properly administer Mozambique. So Mozambique drifted. The Prazeiros did their thing. The Gaza Kingdom expanded, the slave trade continued, and the Portuguese government just kind of hoped it would all work out somehow. Then, in the late 1800s, European interest in Africa exploded. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 formalised the scramble for Africa, with European powers carving up the continent into spheres of influence. Portugal, desperate to hold on to what little empire it had left, suddenly had to prove it actually controlled Mozambique, or risk losing it to Britain, Germany or France. The Portuguese proposed the pink map, a plan to link Angola and Mozambique by claiming all the territory in between, which would have included modern Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. Britain, which had its own imperial ambitions in the region, blocked the plan immediately. But Portugal managed to retain colonial rights over Mozambique and Angola, mainly because the other powers didn't care enough to fight about it. This forced Portugal to actually start administering Mozambique properly, which they'd been avoiding for centuries. They launched military campaigns to assert control over the interior. They fought and defeated Gungunjana in 1895, ending the Gaza kingdom and exiling him to the Azores, where he died. They tried to break the power of the Prazeros, with mixed success. And they started shifting the administration to private chartered companies, the Mozambique Company, the Zambezi Company, the Niassa Company, which were basically corporations, granted the authority to govern large chunks of territory in exchange for building infrastructure and extracting resources. These companies, financed mostly by British capital, built railways to connect Mozambique's ports with neighbouring British colonies in Rhodesia and South Africa. They enacted forced labour policies. They turned Mozambique into a labour reserve for South African mines, and they continued many of the exploitative practices that had defined Portuguese rule for the previous 3 centuries, just with better accounting. So by the time we reached 1900, Mozambique had finally, technically, come under centralised Portuguese control. The prazos were being dismantled. The Gaza kingdom was gone. The slave trade had been suppressed mostly. But the legacy of those 3 centuries, the fragmented political landscape, the economic dependence on extractive industries, the absence of infrastructure, the trauma of mass enslavement, the violent disruption of traditional societies, all of that was still there, shaping everything that came next. Chapter 4. The Estado Novo and the Long Road to Freedom. So by 1900, Portugal had finally achieved centralised control over Mozambique, which meant they could now exploit it properly. The Portuguese colonial system in the 20th century was built on 3 pillars: forced labour, resource extraction, and the ideological fiction that Mozambique wasn't a colony at all, but rather an overseas province of Portugal itself. This semantic trick allowed Portugal to avoid international pressure to decolonize while continuing to run Mozambique exactly like a colony. And run it they did, with a brutality and inefficiency that made even other European colonial powers uncomfortable. The centrepiece of Portuguese colonial labour policy was a system called chibalo. Officially, slavery had been abolished in Mozambique in 1869. In practice, Portugal just rebranded it. Under chibalo, which was codified into law in 1899 and then systematically enforced starting in 1926, all African men who couldn't prove they were employed in the formal economy were required to work for the colonial state or for private employers for 6 months out of every year. The official justification was a moral obligation to work, the idea that Africans needed to be civilized through labor. The actual purpose was to provide a steady supply of unpaid or barely paid workers for Portuguese settlers, chartered companies, and infrastructure projects. Men were rounded up by local police, often with the help of traditional chiefs who'd been co-opted into the colonial administration, and sent to plantations, mines, road construction sites, or settler farms. They worked under brutal conditions: violence, beatings, sexual assault, public humiliation was routine. Wages, when paid at all, were a fraction of what Portuguese workers received. The system was designed to be inescapable. If you wanted to avoid chibalo, you had 2 options: get a formal job which required literacy and education that the Portuguese deliberately withheld from Africans, or flee to South Africa to work in the mines. Hundreds of thousands of Mozambican men chose the second option. By the mid-20th century, Mozambicans made up a larger share of the South African mining workforce than South Africans themselves. And this wasn't accidental. The Portuguese colonial government had agreements with South Africa that effectively turned Mozambique into a labour reserve. Mozambican workers would go to the mines, send remittances home, and Portugal would collect fees from South Africa for providing the labour. It was a perfectly designed system of extraction. Portugal got revenue, South Africa got cheap workers, and Mozambican men got to choose between the threat of chibalo at home or dangerous mine work abroad. One miner, quoted years later, put it plainly, "It was the fear of chibalo that made you run back to the mines after only a short time at home." Agriculture was transformed to serve Portuguese interests. Farmers were forced to grow cash crops, cotton, sugar, tea, tobacco instead of food. The cotton scheme was particularly brutal. Under rules enforced by the 1930s, rural households in designated cotton zones were required to cultivate cotton and sell it to Portuguese buyers at prices set by the colonial government. These prices were deliberately kept low. The work was back-breaking, and if you didn't meet your quota, you could be sent to chibalo or beaten by colonial overseers called capatazes. The Portuguese justified this by claiming they were teaching Africans modern agricultural techniques. But what they were actually doing was diverting labour and land away from food production and into commodity exports that enriched Portugal. The result was chronic food insecurity, malnutrition, and periodic famines. Peasants called cotton the mother of poverty, which is about as blunt an assessment as you can get. Land was seized using legal tricks. The colonial government declared land unused, even when African communities were actively farming it, then transferred ownership to Portuguese settlers. Settlers ran large estates growing export crops, all of it powered by forced African labour through chibalo. By 1950, there were fewer than 100,000 Portuguese settlers in Mozambique, ruling over more than 5 million Africans. The Portuguese controlled the best farmland, the ports, the railways, the government, the schools, and the police. Africans were locked out of political power, economic opportunity, and social mobility. The legal system codified this through the Indiginato, a framework that classified Africans as indigenous subjects rather than citizens, denying them basic rights unless they could prove they'd been assimilated into Portuguese culture by adopting Christianity, speaking Portuguese fluently, and demonstrating civilized behaviour. Fewer than 1% of Mozambicans ever qualified. In 1926, Portugal itself underwent a political transformation that made things in Mozambique even worse. A military coup brought Antonio de Oliveira Salazar to power, and by 1932 he'd established the Estado Novo, the new state, a fascist-adjacent authoritarian regime that would last until 1974. The Estado Novo clung to its colonies with ideological fervour. While Britain, France and Belgium were beginning to decolonise in the 1950s and 60s, Portugal refused. Salazar genuinely believed that Portugal's overseas provinces were integral parts of the nation, that giving them up would be a betrayal of Portugal's historical mission. So when other European powers were negotiating independence with their colonies, Portugal was doubling down, sending more troops, tightening control, and insisting that Mozambique would remain Portuguese forever. This created a problem, because by the 1950s, nationalist movements were emerging across Africa. Mozambicans who'd been educated abroad, who'd experienced life outside the colony, who'd been exposed to anti-colonial ideas circulating in places like Dar es Salaam and Accra, started organising. It wasn't safe to do this inside Mozambique, Portugal's secret police, the PIDE, arrested or killed anyone suspected of nationalist activity. So, exiled Mozambicans met in Tanganyika in 1962 and merged three smaller groups into a single organization, the Frente de Libertação de Moçambique, FRELIMO, the Mozambique Liberation Front. The first leader of FRELIMO was Eduardo Mondlane, an anthropologist and sociologist who'd been educated in South Africa and the United States, taught at Syracuse University, and worked for the United Nations. Mondlane was a remarkable figure. He was charismatic, politically savvy, and able to navigate the complex ideological landscape of the early 1960s. He secured support from both the Soviet Union and Western countries, including initial CIA funding in 1963, though the US cut ties by 1968 when it became clear FRELIMO was moving in a socialist direction. He also built relationships with newly independent African states and non-aligned nations. Mondlane's strategy was to unite Mozambicans across ethnic and regional lines around a common goal: independence and the creation of a socialist society that would dismantle the colonial structures of exploitation. FRELIMO tried peaceful negotiation first. It failed. The Portuguese government refused to even discuss independence. So, on September 25, 1964, FRELIMO launched its first military attack against a Portuguese administrative post in Cabo Delgado province in the far north. The war had begun. FRELIMO's strategy was classic guerrilla warfare: small units, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, sabotage of infrastructure, and then melting back into the countryside before Portuguese forces could respond. They took advantage of the monsoon season when heavy rains made air surveillance useless and movement difficult for Portuguese troops. They established liberated zones in the north, areas where FRELIMO controlled the countryside, and set up schools, clinics, and parallel governance structures. They couldn't take the cities, but they didn't need to. The goal was to make Portuguese control so costly and unsustainable that Portugal would eventually give up. Portugal responded by deploying 70,000 troops. They built fortified positions. They relocated rural populations into strategic hamlets to cut off FRELIMO's support base. They conducted aerial bombardments and counterinsurgency operations, and they spent money they didn't have. By the early 1970s, Portugal was devoting 40% of its national budget to fighting wars in Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau. For a poor European country that was already struggling economically, this was unsustainable. But the Estado Novo regime wouldn't back down. Salazar, and after his incapacitation in 1968, his successor, Marcelo Caetano, insisted that Portugal would fight to the last man to keep its empire. Within FRELIMO, there were tensions. Mondlane was trying to hold together a coalition that included moderates who wanted independence but not necessarily socialism, and radicals like Samora Machel and Marcelino dos Santos, who wanted to fundamentally transform Mozambican society along Marxist-Leninist lines. These tensions were never fully resolved, partly because in February 1969, Eduardo Mondlane was killed by a bomb at FRELIMO headquarters in Dar es Salaam. The details are disputed. Some accounts say it was a parcel bomb, others say an explosive device planted in a chair, but the most likely culprit was Portugal's secret police, possibly with help from internal FRELIMO factions who opposed Mondlane's leadership. His death created a succession crisis that was eventually resolved in favour of the radicals. Samora Machel, a pragmatic military commander, took over leadership in 1970 and shifted FRELIMO decisively toward Marxism-Leninism. By the early 1970s, FRELIMO controlled about a third of Mozambique's territory, mostly in the north and parts of the centre. They'd infiltrated into areas closer to the south. The Portuguese military was exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly convinced the war was unwinnable. Young Portuguese officers who'd been sent to fight in Africa were watching their peers die in what felt like a pointless colonial conflict, while Portugal itself stagnated under an authoritarian regime that refused to modernize. And then, on April 25th, 1974, those officers staged a coup in Lisbon, the Carnation Revolution, named after the flowers that civilians placed in the barrels of soldiers' rifles, overthrew the Estado Novo regime and installed a left-leaning military government that immediately signalled it was willing to negotiate decolonization. FRELIMO, from a position of military strength, demanded a complete handover of power, no gradual transition, no power sharing with Portuguese settlers, independence, and FRELIMO as the government. Portugal, exhausted and politically transformed, agreed. On June 25, 1975, exactly 13 years after FRELIMO's founding, Mozambique became independent. Samora Machel became the first president. FRELIMO established a one-party Marxist-Leninist state, and within a year almost the entire Portuguese settler population, about 200,000 people, had fled the country. The exodus of settlers created immediate problems. They took their skills, their capital, and in many cases they sabotaged infrastructure on their way out, pouring concrete down wells, destroying machinery, burning records. Mozambique inherited an economy that had been designed to extract resources and funnel profits to Portugal, a population where 95% of people were illiterate, virtually no infrastructure outside the major cities, and a government with almost no Mozambicans trained in administration because the Portuguese had deliberately excluded Africans from these roles. FRELIMO had won independence, but what they'd won was a disaster. And it was about to get worse, because FRELIMO's commitment to supporting liberation movements in neighbouring countries, allowing the ANC to operate from Mozambique against apartheid South Africa, supporting ZANU guerrillas fighting Rhodesia's white minority government, meant that Mozambique immediately became a target. Rhodesia and South Africa, furious that a Marxist government was providing sanctuary to their enemies, began funding and arming a rebel group called RENAMO, the Mozambican National Resistance. What started as a destabilization campaign would turn into a 16-year civil war that would kill 1 million people, displace millions more, and destroy what little infrastructure Mozambique had managed to build. But that nightmare, as horrific as it was, belongs to the next chapter. For now, it's 1975. Mozambique is free. The Portuguese are gone. FRELIMO is in power. The people are celebrating. And absolutely nobody understands how bad the next 2 decades are going to be. Chapter 5. 16 Years of Hell. The celebrations in 1975 didn't last long. FRELIMO inherited a country with almost no functional infrastructure, 95% illiteracy, and an economy that had been designed to extract resources for Portugal rather than sustain the people who actually lived there. The Portuguese settlers who fled took their expertise with them, and in many cases sabotaged what they couldn't take, destroying machinery, burning records, pouring concrete down wells. Banks had no trained staff, hospitals had no doctors, schools had no teachers, the civil service barely existed. FRELIMO's leadership, trained in guerrilla warfare and Marxist-Leninist ideology, was suddenly trying to run a country. They had revolutionary zeal and almost no administrative experience. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. FRELIMO's early policies were ambitious and ideologically driven. They nationalised land, banks, schools, and healthcare. They abolished private property and established collective farms called aldeias comunais, communal villages, where rural populations were supposed to live and farm cooperatively. The theory was that this would modernize agriculture, increase production, break the power of traditional chiefs, and create a socialist society where resources were distributed equitably. The practice was forced relocation of millions of people from their ancestral lands to new settlements where they were expected to work collectively on crops they didn't choose, using methods imposed from above for the benefit of the state. Farmers didn't want to abandon their family lands. They resisted. Production collapsed. Traditional authorities, who'd maintained social order and spiritual legitimacy for generations, were sidelined. FRELIMO viewed them as backward relics of colonial collaboration, which was partly true but also missed the point that these chiefs still commanded genuine respect and loyalty from rural populations. Alienating them meant alienating their communities, and FRELIMO's aggressive secularism, closing mission schools, suppressing religious activities, dismissing traditional spiritual practices as superstition, created resentment in a country where religion and ancestral beliefs weren't just cultural add-ons, but fundamental to how people understood the world. FRELIMO was trying to engineer a new society from scratch, and they were doing it with the blunt instruments of state power and ideological certainty. It went about as well as you'd expect. Meanwhile, FRELIMO's foreign policy was making enemies. The government declared support for liberation movements in neighbouring countries, allowing the African National Congress to operate from Mozambique against apartheid South Africa and providing bases for ZANU guerrillas fighting Rhodesia's white minority government. In March 1976, Mozambique closed its border with Rhodesia and enforced UN sanctions, which cost the country millions in lost trade revenue and transit fees. This was ideologically consistent. FRELIMO had been supported by Tanzania during its own war, and now it was paying it forward, but it made Mozambique an immediate military and economic target. Rhodesia and South Africa, both white minority regimes threatened by black nationalist movements, were not going to tolerate a Marxist government providing sanctuary to their enemies, and they had the military capacity to do something about it. In 1975, even before Mozambique's independence was formalized, Rhodesia's Central Intelligence Organization had started building an anti-FRELIMO insurgency. They recruited Andre Matsangaisa, a former FRELIMO official who'd been imprisoned in a re-education camp for stealing radios and other property. Rhodesian forces freed him during a raid in 1976, trained him in guerrilla tactics, and installed him as the leader of a new organization, the Resistencia Nacional Moçambicana, RENAMO. The initial goal was intelligence gathering and disrupting ZANU bases inside Mozambique, but it quickly evolved into a full-scale destabilization campaign aimed at destroying FRELIMO's government. RENAMO was composed of former Portuguese colonial soldiers, disaffected FRELIMO members, anti-communists, and people recruited often forcibly from areas where FRELIMO's policies had created grievances. It was a coalition held together by external support and opposition to FRELIMO, rather than any coherent political program. RENAMO launched its first attacks in May 1977, targeting government buildings, infrastructure, and FRELIMO officials in the central provinces. Matsangaisa was killed in combat in October 1979 during a failed attack on a FRELIMO base, and leadership passed to Afonso Dhlakama, a charismatic commander who would run the organization until his death in 2018. When Rhodesia became Zimbabwe in 1980, and Robert Mugabe's government began supporting FRELIMO, including sending troops to fight RENAMO, South Africa stepped in to fill the gap. The apartheid regime, terrified of a Marxist state on its border supporting the ANC and potentially inspiring South Africa's own black majority, poured money, weapons, training, and logistical support into Renamo. What had started as a Rhodesian proxy became a South African one, and the scale of support increased dramatically. The war that followed was catastrophic. Renamo's strategy was terrorism disguised as insurgency. They couldn't defeat FRELIMO militarily. They lacked the numbers, the equipment, and the organizational capacity to hold cities or challenge government forces in conventional battles. So they targeted the civilian population and infrastructure. They burned schools because educated populations were harder to control. They destroyed health clinics because providing healthcare was how FRELIMO built legitimacy. They blew up roads and railways because cutting supply lines weakened the government. They mined fields and villages, turning productive land into death traps. They kidnapped children and forced them to become soldiers, sometimes making them commit atrocities against their own families to ensure they couldn't go home. And they massacred civilians in ways designed to create maximum terror, burning people alive, dismembering them, forcing family members to kill each other, leaving mutilated bodies on display as warnings. Human rights organizations documented atrocities on both sides. FRELIMO forces executed suspected RENAMO collaborators, ran brutal re-education camps, and committed abuses during counterinsurgency operations. But RENAMO's brutality was systematic and strategic. They earned the nickname armed bandits, and international observers called them a parasite army that sustained itself by terrorizing and exploiting civilians. The goal was to make rural Mozambique ungovernable, to destroy confidence in FRELIMO, to collapse the economy, and to force the population into submission through sheer terror. And it worked. By the mid-1980s, large parts of the countryside were lawless zones where government authority had completely evaporated. FRELIMO, fighting with Soviet and Cuban support, couldn't protect rural areas. They controlled the cities and major towns, Maputo, Beira, Nampula, but RENAMO operated freely in the countryside, especially in the central provinces of Sofala, Manica and Zambezia, and in parts of the north. Villages were caught in the middle. FRELIMO would arrive and demand food, intelligence, recruits. RENAMO would arrive and punish anyone who'd cooperated with FRELIMO. If you helped the government, RENAMO killed you. If you helped RENAMO, FRELIMO arrested you. Civilians had no good options. Millions fled. By the mid-1980s, Mozambique had over 1 million refugees in neighbouring Malawi, Zimbabwe, Tanzania and South Africa, and several million more internally displaced. Entire regions were depopulated. The economic impact was staggering. Agriculture, which employed the vast majority of the population, collapsed. Farmers couldn't plant or harvest when their fields were mined or their villages were being attacked. The few collective farms that had been established were systematically destroyed by RENAMO. Food production plummeted. Mozambique, which had the potential to be agriculturally self-sufficient, became dependent on food aid. Roads became impassable, either destroyed by RENAMO or too dangerous to use. Railways were blown up. The port at Beira, which had been a major regional hub connecting landlocked Zimbabwe and Zambia to the ocean, was bombed by Rhodesia in 1979 and never fully recovered. Trade collapsed. Foreign investment disappeared. The government's revenue base evaporated just as the costs of fighting the war skyrocketed. By the early 1980s, Mozambique was experiencing famine. Not crop failure from natural causes, this was famine created by deliberate policy and military strategy. RENAMO burned crops, killed livestock, destroyed grain stores. FRELIMO's forced collectivization had already disrupted traditional farming. The combination was lethal. Hundreds of thousands of people were dying from starvation and disease. Malnutrition left populations vulnerable to epidemics. Cholera, malaria, dysentery swept through displaced populations living in camps with no sanitation. International aid organizations poured in, but aid convoys were attacked by RENAMO. Relief workers were killed. The war made it almost impossible to deliver help to the people who needed it most. FRELIMO's socialist policies, which had already been failing before the war, became completely unworkable. Collective farms couldn't function when RENAMO was burning villages. State-run industries couldn't operate when supply chains didn't exist. The economy was in freefall. By 1983, President Machel privately admitted to other African leaders that socialism wasn't working. In 1984, FRELIMO made a humiliating ideological retreat. They joined the World Bank and IMF and accepted structural adjustment programs that required privatization, market liberalization, and the abandonment of socialist economic policies. A Marxist-Leninist government was implementing capitalism because reality had made it impossible to continue, but it didn't end the war. If anything, it intensified, because South Africa saw FRELIMO's weakness and doubled down on support for RENAMO. In October 1986, President Samora Machel died when his plane crashed in the Lebombo Mountains near the South African border. He'd been returning from a summit in Zambia. The official investigation blamed pilot error, but the circumstances were deeply suspicious. The plane veered off course into South African territory. A decoy radio beacon may have been used to lure it off track. South Africa denied involvement. Many Mozambicans believed and still believe it was an assassination. Machel was FRELIMO's most charismatic leader, a genuine revolutionary hero, and his death was a psychological blow. Joaquim Chissano, who'd been serving as foreign minister, became president and inherited a country that was disintegrating. The economy was in freefall. The war was consuming everything. Soviet support, which had been sustaining FRELIMO militarily, was beginning to waver as the Soviet Union itself entered terminal decline. Zimbabwe sent troops to support FRELIMO, eventually deploying thousands of soldiers who conducted joint operations against RENAMO strongholds in the Gorongosa region. Tanzania sent forces to protect key infrastructure. North Korean advisors helped train FRELIMO's first specialized counterinsurgency brigade in the early 1980s. East Germany provided military assistance and training. Cuba sent advisors. Romania sent troops. But none of it was enough to decisively defeat RENAMO, partly because RENAMO wasn't trying to win territory or establish governance. They were just destroying things, and destruction is easier than building. By the late 1980s, FRELIMO controlled maybe 40% of the country's territory. RENAMO controlled or contested most of the countryside, and neither side had the capacity to win outright. It was a stalemate measured in corpses. The turning point came from outside Mozambique. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed, the Cold War ended. Suddenly, the ideological contest that had fueled the conflict lost its meaning. FRELIMO couldn't count on Soviet support anymore. There was no Soviet Union to provide it. South Africa, facing its own internal transformation toward black majority rule after decades of international pressure and internal resistance, stopped funding RENAMO. Both sides were exhausted, broke, and losing their external backers. The war had become pointless. In November 1990, Mozambique adopted a new constitution that ended one-party rule, guaranteed multi-party democracy, and abandoned Marxism-Leninism as state ideology. This was FRELIMO acknowledging that the revolutionary project had failed. They were transitioning from a Marxist vanguard party to a centre-left political party operating in a market economy. It was pragmatism born of desperation. peace talks began in Rome in July 1990, mediated by the community of Sant'Egidio, a Catholic lay organization with support from the Italian government. The negotiations were slow, difficult, and contentious. Both sides had committed atrocities. Trust didn't exist, but both sides also had incentives to negotiate. FRELIMO needed to end a war it couldn't win. RENAMO needed political legitimacy and a path to power now that its external sponsors were gone. On October 4, 1992, FRELIMO and RENAMO signed the Rome General Peace Accords. The war was over. 16 years of fighting. Over 1 million people dead from violence, starvation, disease. 5 million displaced, roughly a third of the population. The countryside salted with an estimated 2 million landmines that would kill and maim people for decades. Schools, hospitals, roads, railways, bridges, entire towns destroyed. An economy that had been weak to begin with now utterly shattered, and a population traumatized in ways that statistics can't capture. Children who'd been forced to fight, women who'd been raped, families torn apart, communities destroyed. The psychological scars would last generations. UN peacekeepers arrived to oversee disarmament and demobilization. Both FRELIMO and RENAMO forces were supposed to hand over their weapons and integrate into a new unified military. The process was chaotic. Soldiers waited in demobilization camps for months without pay or food, and some staged violent protests. But gradually, the fighting stopped. In October 1994, Mozambique held its first democratic multi-party elections. Joaquim Chissano won the presidency with 53% of the vote. FRELIMO won 129 seats in the National Assembly. RENAMO, now a political party, won 112 seats, drawing most of its support from rural areas where they'd operated during the war. Afonso Dhlakama accepted the results despite alleging fraud. The fact that the elections happened at all, that RENAMO peacefully participated, that the results were broadly accepted and led to a democratic transfer of power. This was remarkable given what the country had just been through. But Mozambique in 1994 was broken in almost every measurable way. Life expectancy was under 40 years, one of the lowest in the world. GDP per capita was roughly $200, among the absolute poorest. Infrastructure barely existed outside Maputo. 2 million landmines littered the countryside it would take until 2015 to clear them all. An entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but war. Literacy rates were abysmal. Health systems were non-existent in rural areas. The challenges ahead were immense. And yet, there was something that hadn't been there before, a chance. A real, fragile, uncertain chance to build something better. The war was over. The ideological battles were done. FRELIMO and RENAMO were going to compete at the ballot box instead of the battlefield. The question now was whether Mozambique could recover, rebuild, and create a future that wasn't defined by centuries of exploitation and decades of violence. That's where we're headed in the final chapter. Chapter 6. The Unfinished Project. Mozambique in the mid-1990s faced a question that's haunted countries emerging from catastrophic violence. What do you build on ruins? The infrastructure was destroyed. The economy barely functioned. 2 million landmines were scattered across farmland and villages. An entire generation had grown up in war. But there was peace, and there were elections, and there was, however, tentative hope. The challenge was turning that hope into something real. Schools that worked, hospitals that had medicine, roads you could drive on without exploding, an economy that created jobs instead of just extracting whatever resources hadn't been stolen yet. It was an immense task, and for a while it looked like Mozambique might actually pull it off. Economic growth in the late 1990s and early 2000s was remarkable. GDP grew at an average of 8% annually between 1996 and 2008, making Mozambique one of the fastest growing economies in Africa. International donors poured in billions in aid. Debt was forgiven under the heavily indebted Poor Countries Initiative. Wealthy nations cancelled over $600 million in obligations. The IMF and World Bank praised Mozambique as a success story of post-conflict reconstruction and market-oriented reform, holding it up as proof that structural adjustment programs and foreign investment could rebuild war-torn economies. The government invested in infrastructure, rebuilding the North-South Highway, restoring the port at Beira, clearing landmines with international help. Agricultural production recovered as displaced farmers returned to their land. Foreign investment started returning, drawn by cheap labour, abundant resources, and a government willing to offer favourable terms. For a country that had been written off as a failed state just a decade earlier, this was extraordinary progress. But the growth didn't reach most people. Poverty rates remained stubbornly above 50% throughout the 2000s. The gains were concentrated in Maputo and a few other urban centres, where mega-projects, an aluminum smelter built by BHP Billiton, coal mines in Tete province, infrastructure projects funded by donor money created pockets of modernity. Rural areas, where 70% of Mozambicans lived, saw limited improvement. Subsistence agriculture remained the norm. Access to electricity, clean water, healthcare and education barely changed. The economic model, export-oriented, dependent on foreign investment in large infrastructure projects with minimal local content requirements, created enclaves of development rather than broad-based prosperity. The aluminum smelter employed few Mozambicans and paid minimal taxes thanks to generous concessions. Coal exports enriched mining companies, and a small network of connected elites but generated little spillover benefit. Jobs were scarce, especially for young people. Inequality widened dramatically, and corruption, which had been a feature of Mozambican governance since independence, became systematic, increasingly brazen, and central to how the state functioned. Natural disasters kept hitting. In February and March 2000, catastrophic floods submerged large parts of the south. Two cyclones, Ellen and then Gloria, dumped months' worth of rain in weeks. The Limpopo, Incomati, and other rivers overflowed simultaneously for the first time in recorded history. At least 700 people died. 650,000 were displaced. 4.5 million, a quarter of the population, were affected. Agricultural land was destroyed. Infrastructure that had just been rebuilt was washed away. GDP growth dropped from a projected 7% to 1.5%. The floods undid years of progress in weeks. And it kept happening. Mozambique's geography makes it extraordinarily vulnerable. It's downstream from 9 major river systems, meaning it has to manage water that falls in neighbouring countries. It sits on the Indian Ocean, directly in the path of tropical cyclones that form in the southwestern Indian Ocean every year. Climate change has made both worse. In 2007 and 2008, central Mozambique flooded again. In 2019, Cyclone Idai hit Beira with winds up to 220 kilometers per hour, killing hundreds, displacing hundreds of thousands, destroying nearly 800,000 hectares of crops. 6 weeks later, Cyclone Kenneth struck the north, the strongest cyclone ever recorded to hit the African continent. In 2023, Cyclone Freddy brought more devastation. The pattern is relentless. Rebuild, get hit. Rebuild, get hit. Then, in 2010, Mozambique discovered natural gas. Massive offshore reserves in the Rovuma Basin off Cabo Delgado province, around 150 trillion cubic feet, making Mozambique the third largest holder of natural gas reserves in Africa after Nigeria and Algeria. The projections were staggering. The IMF estimated potential revenues of $500 billion by 2045. Average real GDP growth could hit 24% annually once LNG production started. International energy companies Anadarko, Eni, ExxonMobil, Total Energies lined up to invest tens of billions. This was supposed to transform Mozambique's economy, lift millions out of poverty, finally deliver the prosperity that had been promised since independence. The gas would flow, the money would follow, and Mozambique would join the ranks of middle-income countries. But the gas deals were structured to benefit foreign companies first. Revenue would primarily go toward recovering investors' costs in the initial years, with most money for Mozambique not arriving until the mid-2030s and 2040s. The government had limited involvement in the value chain. Mozambique got extraction revenue but not processing, shipping, storing or trading profits, all of which went to foreign firms. Tax structures were remarkably favourable to companies, including fiscal stability clauses that locked in rates for decades. Some companies reportedly set up special-purpose vehicles in Dubai to avoid withholding taxes entirely. And Mozambique, desperate for the jobs and revenue these projects promised, accepted terms that guaranteed most of the wealth would flow abroad. Then, in 2016, the House of Cards collapsed. It emerged that Mozambique's government had secretly borrowed $2 billion between 2013 and 2014 from Credit Suisse and VTB Russia. The loans were ostensibly for buying a tuna fishing fleet and maritime security equipment to protect the gas fields. Except the loans were illegal, signed without parliamentary approval as required by law. The interest rates were punishingly high, and much of the money disappeared into corruption. The fishing boats were overpriced and barely functional. Hundreds of millions were simply stolen, enriching government officials and their associates. When the scandal broke, donors froze aid. The currency collapsed. The economy went into crisis. Mozambique defaulted on its debt. The hidden debt scandal revealed that the promise of gas wealth had already been mortgaged and stolen before a single cubic foot had been extracted. Several Mozambican officials were later indicted. Credit Suisse bankers were convicted in US courts. But the damage was done, investor confidence evaporated, and Mozambique entered another economic crisis. And then came the insurgency. In October 2017, armed militants attacked 3 police stations in Mocimboa da Praia district in Cabo Delgado. The group called itself Ansar al-Sunnah, locally known as Al-Shabaab, though unrelated to the Somali group. They were Mozambican, mostly young men from the Mwani and Makwa ethnic groups, radicalized by a mix of religious extremism imported from Tanzania and Sudan, and genuine socio-economic grievances. Cabo Delgado, despite sitting on top of gas wealth, rubies discovered in 2009, graphite deposits found in 2014, and valuable timber, was one of the poorest and most neglected regions in the country. The state barely functioned there. Infrastructure was non-existent. Schools had no teachers. Clinics had no medicine. Unemployment, especially youth unemployment, was endemic. Illegal logging by Chinese companies backed by Maputo elites had stripped forests. When rubies were discovered, artisanal miners who found them were violently evicted by security forces to make way for a British mining company connected to FRELIMO. People watched foreign companies prepare to extract billions of dollars while they remained desperately poor, and the government offered nothing in return. The insurgency didn't come from nowhere. The insurgents attacked government buildings, killed officials, burned villages, beheaded civilians. They used tactics deliberately designed to terrorize mass executions, public beheadings, forcing people to watch family members killed. By 2019, they'd begun declaring allegiance to the Islamic State, which recognized them as the Islamic State Central Africa province. The violence escalated. They captured Mocimboa da Praia, a district capital, and held it for months. In March 2021, insurgents attacked Palma, the town adjacent to Total Energy's $20 billion LNG project. Over 1,000 people were killed, including foreign workers trying to evacuate. Total Energies declared force majeure and suspended operations. The gas boom that was supposed to save Mozambique's economy was put on hold indefinitely. Billions of dollars in investment, thousands of promised jobs, the entire economic development plan for the North, all frozen because the government couldn't provide basic security. The Mozambican government, militarily incompetent and unwilling to address the root causes of the insurgency, invited foreign intervention. Rwanda sent 3,000 troops. The Southern African Development Community deployed its own mission. Private military companies, Russian Wagner Group mercenaries, South African contractors got involved. By 2024, the insurgency had been pushed back but not defeated. Over 6,000 people had been killed. More than 1 million displaced roughly half of Cabo Delgado's population. The gas projects remained suspended. And the fundamental problem, massive resource wealth in a region with no state capacity, no economic opportunity, and deep grievances against the central government remained unsolved. Politically, FRELIMO has maintained power continuously since independence. They won every presidential and parliamentary election from 1994 onward. Joaquim Chissano served until 2004, then handed power to Armando Guebuza, who served until 2014. Filipe Nyusi succeeded him and was re-elected in 2019. RENAMO remained the main opposition party, perpetually losing elections and periodically alleging fraud. And they weren't entirely wrong. Mozambican elections have been marked by credible accusations of manipulation, vote rigging, and intimidation. FRELIMO's dominance isn't just electoral success, it's institutional capture. The party controls the state, the military, the judiciary, and much of the economy through patronage networks and state-owned enterprises. This matters because Mozambique's problems require political solutions, and FRELIMO has shown limited interest in reform. Corruption is pervasive. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative repeatedly ranks Mozambique poorly on revenue transparency. State capture by elites means that resource wealth, whether gas, coal, rubies, or timber, flows to a small network of connected individuals rather than the public. The hidden debt scandal wasn't an aberration. It was a symptom of a governance system designed for extraction by elites rather than development for citizens. And yet, there are things that work. Life expectancy has increased from under 40 in the 1990s to around 60 today. Infant mortality has dropped. Primary school enrollment has risen, though quality remains abysmal. HIV prevalence has decreased. Landmines have been cleared. Peace has mostly held the civil war didn't restart, even during RENAMO's low-level insurgency in the 2010s. These aren't trivial achievements for a country that was completely destroyed 30 years ago. But Mozambique in 2026 remains one of the poorest countries on earth. Roughly 60% of the population lives in extreme poverty. Most people survive on subsistence agriculture. Infrastructure outside major cities is minimal. The economy is heavily dependent on a few large projects: aluminum smelting, coal mining, eventually gas extraction that employ few Mozambicans and generate limited spillover benefits. The promise of gas wealth, which was supposed to arrive this decade, has been postponed indefinitely by insurgency and global energy market shifts toward renewables, young Mozambicans, who make up the majority of the population, face unemployment, limited education, and almost no economic opportunities. The pattern is depressingly consistent. Mozambique makes progress, then gets hit by a disaster, natural or man-made, that erases gains. Rebuild, get flooded. Stabilize, discover hidden debts, attract investment, face insurgency. The fundamental question isn't whether Mozambique can recover from the latest crisis. It's done that repeatedly. The question is whether it can build systems, political, economic, social, that are resilient enough to withstand the next shock and equitable enough to actually improve ordinary people's lives. Right now, the answer is unclear. The insurgency in Cabo Delgado could be contained or could metastasize. The gas projects could resume and generate revenue, or could be stranded assets in a world transitioning away from fossil fuels. FRELIMO could reform or could continue its pattern of elite capture and corruption. Mozambicans could continue emigrating in search of opportunities elsewhere, or could build a future at home. Climate change will keep delivering cyclones and floods, and Mozambique will need to adapt or keep rebuilding the same infrastructure over and over. What Mozambique has, after 500 years of exploitation and 50 years of independence, is a chance, not a guarantee, not a clear path, just a chance to build something better than what came before. It's faced longer odds. The country survived the Portuguese, survived civil war, survived famine and floods and corruption scandals and insurgencies. The question isn't survival. Mozambicans have proven they can survive almost anything. The question is whether survival is enough, or whether there's a way forward that doesn't just replicate the patterns of the past, extraction benefiting outsiders, governance serving elites, disaster wiping out progress, hope deferred indefinitely. Whether Mozambique can move from being a country that endures catastrophes to one that actually thrives. Whether the project that started in 1975, building a nation that serves its people rather than foreign interests, can ever be completed. That's the unfinished project, and it's still very much in progress.